Who wrote the Gospels and when? If we look at the Christian Bible, we notice that it is divided into two sections, referred to commonly as Old Testament and New Testament. Then if we look at the first four sections of the New Testament, commonly called books, we see that they are called Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. These are commonly referred to as the Gospels, where gospel is loosely translated as good news. So therefore these books purport to tell us the good news of Jesus Christ. So the first thing we can establish here is that these Gospels exist, because we got them, so therefore they do exist. This is an irrefutable fact. When then were these Gospels written, and by who? From this distance in time, we cannot prove who wrote the books of the New Testament, or when. And of course, the same applies to Julius Caesar's Gallic War, Homer's Iliad, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. All we have to rely on is historical evidence. Of course, the closer we are in time to when these were actually written, the better the evidence and the more evidence that we have. So for example, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is relatively recent, so we've got pretty good evidence and we are pretty confident that J.R.R. Tolkien actually wrote that. But the further we go back, the less we seem to have. But it is worth remembering that those living much closer in time to the writing of the New Testament had little doubt as to who wrote these Gospels and when they were actually written. Around about the start of the last century, George Bernard Shaw wrote his play Pygmalion. And in Pygmalion, which was later turned into the movie My Fair Lady, his protagonist Henry Higgins bemoans at some stage what has happened to the English language. Why can't the English teach their children how to speak, he asks. English is the language of Shakespeare and Milton and the Bible. And by Bible, he meant the authorised King James Version of 1611. So the Gospels existed then as well. And we continue back further and further in time, and we find at various points we can still find the Bible, the Gospels. Just a few little examples pulled at random out of history. In 672 to 735 or thereabouts, Bede lived, and it said, according to Wikipedia, so it must be true if it's in Wikipedia, he produced a translation of the Gospel of John into Old English. So the Gospel of John, at least, existed in his time. We go back a few hundred years further, we get to Jerome, who lived between 347 and 420. And he translated the Bible into Latin. And his Latin version was called the Vulgate, and it became the Bible of the Roman Catholic Church ever since. So therefore, the Gospels existed in his time. And we can go further back, and we find that the original was written in Greek, with various texts and fragments that we can find going back possibly even to the 70s AD. Now there was a fragment found dated around about 65 that was thought to contain a bit of the Gospel of Mark. But it is generally agreed now that that actually wasn't Mark, it was something else altogether. But also there are quotations and references by other ancient writers indicating that whenever it was they wrote what they wrote, the Gospels were already in existence by then. So, who? When? What we can say for certain is that someone wrote them at some time. And when they were written, the person or people concerned knew who and when. And based on the evidence we do have, it is virtually certain that others at that time also knew who and when. It is only with the passage of time that some of this knowledge has been lost. Thus, at the time the Gospels were written, those who received them did so in the conviction that they knew who wrote them and trusted those authors and trusted that these works were genuine. Now, when the canon of the New Testament was established, the main criteria was Was this written by an apostle or by a close associate of an apostle? And everything they included in the New Testament adhered, so they believed, to that criteria. Now, when we read the Greek New Testament, the Gospels are entitled according to XXX, where that could be according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. Which means that these are not just names tacked on to the works. These are statements of authorship. We still have to establish whether those statements are valid or not, but these are statements of authorship of those Gospels. And not only has there never been known to be a doubt until relatively recent times as to the authorship, there has also been no alternate claim. There is no one from ancient times who has claimed, I wrote this Gospel or I wrote that. There have ever only been these four names associated with these four Gospels. Thus, the onus is very much on those disputing the traditional position to provide evidence and proof of their position. Papyri have been found from the late 100s AD, roughly around about 180 to 190, spread widely over the Roman Empire, containing parts of the New Testament. Now, the canon of the New Testament had not been settled at that point, so it didn't have the entire New Testament, but it had the four Gospels and some other works as well that are now part of our New Testament. And as I said, spread widely over the Roman Empire, long distances apart. And in every case, the four Gospels are entitled according to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. There is no variation. None of them have got a different name. None of them even are anonymous. And you would imagine that if these works had been produced later in time by someone else, that at least one or more of these various copies would have had a different name on them or would have been unnamed. Again, this is not proof, but it is very strong evidence that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John were always the names attached to these Gospels. Now, given that the universal consensus of the early church gave Matthew, Mark, Luke and John as the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, one must ask, why does it seem so important to so many to hunt diligently for any excuse to doubt this? Much dating of ancient history is based on Manetho's Egyptian king list in his Aegyptiaca. Now, that basically means history of Egypt. This was written in the 3rd century BC, and no copies survive until today. All we have are quotations from it from documents dated between roughly the 1st and 8th centuries AD. And although it is generally agreed by scholars that you have to take some of his stories with a pinch of salt, nevertheless, his history is largely accepted, so much so that, as I said, much of the dating of the ancient world is based on his king list and his timings and reigns and all that sort of thing of the various kings of Egypt over thousands of years. But his work was written long after the events described. There is little proof or evidence of its veracity. It ignores the fact that there were at various times concurrent separate kings of Upper and Lower Egypt. There are no extant texts, and so on. It seems that only the Bible is assumed false until proven otherwise. Why? These days, it would seem, the announcement of the discovery of a document from the mid-1st century containing text from one of the Gospels would be greeted with considerably greater scepticism than an announcement by NASA that they had found little green aliens on Mars. Unless, of course, that announcement was on April the 1st, of course. But then, another question that someone may raise, what about the other Gospels? There are what are called apocryphal Gospels, entitled by Thomas or by Peter or by others. These do exist. Why were these rejected while the four we have in our Bibles were accepted? Now, unfortunately, this is too big a subject to go into in much detail tonight. But basically, they were not considered genuine at the time by the Christians in the church there and then. They were thought and known to be written much later than the event, with the names of Peter and Thomas and Judas and others tacked on to make them look good and to spread the story. Tertullian was a leading church theologian living between 160 and 220, and in his work Against Marcion he wrote that the churches possessed the 4 Gospels. Not more, not less, and not different to Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. The early church openly acknowledged and discussed uncertainty, or by the author of Hebrews, for example. There was long discussions over hundreds of years even as to who wrote Hebrews. And they eventually decided, yes, this is genuine, and they included it in the Bible. There were some others that they also had deep discussions over. Second Epistle of Peter, for example, had a bit of doubt over it, and they discussed that backwards and forwards for many years. But not so the Gospels. There was never any doubt about these 4 Gospels. The other ones, as I said, there was sincere doubt, and they scrapped them. These ones, there was never any doubt. They were accepted right from the start. Now, as I already mentioned, the names Matthew, Mark, Luke and John have always been attached to the Gospels bearing their names, and no alternate claim was ever proposed, although I will modify that statement slightly a little bit later with regard to John. So far as the early Christians were concerned, anything written by an apostle was more important and given more credence than anything written by anybody else. Thus, Mark and Luke would not have been credited with the works that bear their names unless those early Christians truly believed that to be so. And anyone inventing it would have used a more imposing name, such as Peter on their Gospels, like one of the apocryphal Gospels did. Now, we heard earlier this year from Dr. Stephen Spence that although it was strongly condemned in the 2nd century, we do not know the attitude of the church in the 1st century to pseudepigraphy. Now, pseudepigraphy is where somebody writes something and signs somebody else's name to it in order to get their work more widely disseminated and accepted. Some great name, oh, this is by so-and-so, I better get that one. And that sounds like fraud when we first hear about it, but Dr. Spence then went on to give an example. Imagine, say, a great master has a disciple who follows him all through his life. Eventually this master teacher dies, and the disciple thinks it would be a tragedy for the world if his teaching, if his wisdom is lost. And so he sets out to write in his master's style, his master's teaching. And in the end, he signs his master's name to it, not his own. That doesn't sound quite so bad, and could that have been done with some of the Gospels? Well, it is commonly thought that Mark's Gospel was based on Peter and on Peter's teaching, and yet it is ascribed to Mark and not to Peter. No mention is made in it of Peter. So from that basis, I think it's fair to assume that pseudepigraphy is extremely unlikely. Now, one book that I have worked from a lot in the development of this talk tonight is John Wenham's Redating Matthew, Mark and Luke. A lot of what I'm saying is based on his work. And one of the things he says is that Matthew looks like it may have been originally in a Semitic language. And he gives lots of examples and he goes into some detail to demonstrate his point. And he shows that a Greek translation from Aramaic makes sense of it and includes many direct translations of Aramaic idioms. And so an idiom in one language makes perfect sense. Do a direct translation of that into another language and it doesn't make any sense at all. Just an example going from a dialect of one language to a different dialect of the same language. During the Vietnam War, there was an American mechanic at work on an aeroplane, and he discovered he was missing a tool that he needed. So he went over to the Australian hangar and asked if he could borrow the tool. And the Australian guy said, "Go for your life, mate." So the American shot off across the tarmac as fast as he could go. Because as Australians, we understand that idiom, "go for your life, mate." But the American didn't get it at all. And so examples like that can be found in Matthew's Gospel is one of the things that Wenham uses to show that it seems highly likely, not proved, but highly likely that Matthew was originally written in Aramaic. Matthew's job as a tax collector involved much note-taking and report writing. It is very reasonable to imagine him taking notes at various times, mostly not word for word, but an accurate summary, including, for example, what we refer to these days as the Sermon on the Mount. And this line of thought and reasoning is argued extensively by E.J. Goodspeed in his book, Matthew, Apostle and Evangelist. The early church fathers, from Papias, who lived between AD 60 and 130 on, were virtually unanimous that Matthew the tax collector, also known as Levi, and one of the 12, was the author. That this was the first gospel to be written. That Matthew wrote for Hebrews in the Hebrew language and script. And by Hebrew, he means Aramaic in that context. The elaborate and well-considered arrangement of the book would be more naturally found in an original composition than in an adaptation of other documents, while the masterly presentation of its subject, implying even in an original work, an author of unusual skill, is very difficult to account for in a mere compiler who is supposed to have conflated and interwoven these sources in a complicated patchwork of paragraphs and sentences, which somehow emerged from the process in the shape of a complete and wonderful whole, wrote H.G. Jamieson in The Origin of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, Bill Schroeder wrote, Mark reads like a shorthand account of a story by an impromptu speaker. Now, the testimony of the early church is that when Peter was in Rome, Mark served as his interpreter. And most of the write-ups I've read said there's a little bit of doubt as to exactly what they mean by the word interpreter, but nevertheless, that concept, that Mark was there working closely with Peter. And after Peter left, the Christians in Rome asked Mark to put in writing Peter's teaching about Christ for them, which Mark did, and the result is what we have as the Gospel of Mark today. Now, it's interesting when we read through the New Testament, we notice in John's Gospel that he names names an awful lot more than any of the other Gospel writers. Names like Andrew and Philip and Thomas and Peter, and names all over the place. But one name that is strangely missing is that of John. He avoided referring to himself almost exclusively, and the few times when he could not avoid referring to himself, he was rather oblique and didn't actually use his name. Then if we move on to the book of Acts, Luke is virtually invisible in Acts. And this is very interesting given some of the things in Paul's letters indicate that Luke was a significant player at the time. And if you remember one of Kevin's talks, at least, where he talks about the we passages and the times in Acts where the writing goes from talking about they and them to we and us, indicating where the author, as in Luke, joins up with the party. And those are the only indications we get there of Luke. So when we get to Mark's Gospel, we find that Peter is downplayed and showed in a lesser light than he is in the other Gospels. And if humility was a common feature of early Christian leadership, this would line up with the patristic teaching that Mark was writing what Peter had taught. Now, according to the standard claims of the early church, Luke's Gospel was written by Luke, the companion of Paul, and was later followed by his second work, which I've just mentioned, Acts. Now, the anti-Marcionite prologue to Luke was written possibly around between 160 and 180 AD, says that, indeed, Luke was an Antiochene Syrian, a doctor by profession, a disciple of the apostles. Later, however, he followed Paul until his martyrdom, serving the Lord blamelessly. He never had a wife, he never fathered children, and died at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit in Boeotia. Therefore, although Gospels had already been written, indeed by Matthew in Judea and by Mark in Italy, moved by the Holy Spirit, he wrote down this Gospel in the parts of Achaia, that is, Greece, signifying in the preface that the others were written before his, but also that it was of the greatest importance for him to expound with the greatest diligence the whole series of events in his narration for the Greek believers, so that they would not be led astray by the lure of Jewish fables or seduced by the fables of the heretics and stupid solicitations and fall away from the truth. And so at once, at the start, he took up the extremely necessary story from the birth of John, that is John the Baptist, who is the beginning of the gospel and forerunner of our Lord Jesus Christ, and was a companion in the perfecting of the people, likewise in the introducing of baptism and a companion in martyrdom. And indeed afterwards, the same Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. Now, when we come to John's Gospel, there is a suggestion that the Gospel of John was written by somebody called John. Surprise, surprise. But a John who was a disciple of the Apostle John and wrote around about 120 AD. And if we look at the last couple of verses of John's Gospel, we see something that seems to support this theory, this idea. Where it says that this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So the idea then is that this John, disciple of John, wrote John's Gospel based on what he had learned from the apostle. But the testimony of the early church, once again, is that of the traditional view that it was written by the Apostle John. And as per my earlier statements, that even though the works of an apostle were considered more worthwhile than those of someone else, that did not seem to affect the acceptance of Mark and Luke. And so one would imagine it would not have affected the acceptance of this gospel either, if it had been written by a different John from his close association with the apostle. The Muritorian fragment, written about AD 170, tells us that the fourth gospel is that of John, one of the disciples. To his fellow disciples and bishops who had been urging him to write, he said, "Fast with me from today to 3 days, and what will be revealed to each one, let us tell it to one another." In the same night it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that John should write down all things in his own name, while all of them should review it. So apparently, John was in Ephesus, where he was urged to put into writing the things he had been teaching them that were not already in the other Gospels, particularly of the teaching of Jesus at the Last Supper. So John made a special effort to not write what had already been covered by Matthew, Mark and Luke, and to cover much of the teachings of Jesus. And these last two verses quoted earlier were then the imprimatur of Andrew and the Ephesian elders to validate John's work. Thus, although doubts have been raised in relatively recent years, the virtually unanimous position of the early church, those close in time to the actual writing of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, are that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. What happened there? Okay, nope, you're right. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, is that Mark wrote first. Matthew and Luke used Mark along with their own extra material, plus they used another document known as Q, from the German word Quell, which means source, as an extra source, plus their own stuff that they'd got together separately, and they'd combine that to make their own Gospels. Now, aside from this theory, no evidence of Q actually exists, making it appear as little more than a fudge factor to make the theory work. And thus this theory has been falling out of favour in more recent times. There are actually a plethora of proposed solutions to the synoptic problem. Now, by synoptic problem, if we read the Gospels, we note that Matthew, Mark and Luke have surprising similarities about them, whereas John's is totally different. So the synoptic problem is trying to explain the similarities between Matthew, Mark and Luke and the differences as well. And as I said, there's a plethora of problems. These diagrams here are taken from Wenham's book. And a whole lot more again from Wikipedia. So we have lots of different possible scenarios as to how the Gospels, the first three Gospels, came to be in the form that they are. Now, the only direct statement of authorship in the Gospels themselves is that which I quoted earlier in the end of John. And even then, as I said, it's a little bit oblique. Nevertheless, there was never any doubt in the early church as to the authorship of any of them. If you read the Gospels, you will find hunks of narrative and swathes of teaching from Jesus, including his many parables, or some of them anyway. Some of these are quite extensive and include in places considerable detail. So possible explanations for these include they are pure fiction. It was all made up years later by other authors. Now, of course, this puts those who made up the stories in virtually the same boat as is claimed for Jesus as great moral teachers, but deceptive and dishonest at the same time. So that doesn't quite work very well. And it does not explain the universal belief in their claimed authors by the people living at the time. Or oral tradition, this is a very common one, that Jesus actually did say and do some worthwhile things along the lines of what we read in the Gospels. And people remembered these and repeated them, and sort of like Chinese whispers, what you started out with and what you finished with were quite different in many cases. Again, there isn't really any strong basis for this belief aside from the fact that we know that Chinese whispers do have that effect. But it is presented as a plausible scenario. And it also poses the question as to why we do not have numerous wildly different versions. Or the Holy Spirit caused perfect memories and or special revelation such that the authors of the Gospels got everything word for word. Now, if God is, then this is also a plausible scenario. But once again, it is not seriously considered and does not appear to be the way God does things, assuming that God is. Nor does it appear to be consistent with the biblical record or the historical record for that matter. Jesus had secretaries, official or otherwise, following him around and taking down every word. Now, I think this one, although once again it is plausible, is so far-fetched that I don't think we need to discuss it any further. The last three, though, I think a combination of these last three together are probably the answer of how it all happened. Particular individuals, for example, Matthew and John, we've already heard a suggestion that Matthew did, took extensive notes at various times and were able to refer back to them later when they were writing what they were writing or teaching at various times as well. Or plus, many of Jesus' stories and teachings were repeated more than once. Thus, of course, helping you to remember, because if you hear the same story a number of times, particularly the disciples who follow Jesus everywhere, then they would be more inclined to remember them. Plus, of course, if he told them more than once and they remembered them slightly differently because one remembered better one version, another remembered better another version, that explains minor differences that we see between the Gospels. And finally, the fact that late last year, Dr. Stephen Spence again was explaining to us that ancient cultures were oral cultures. In recent times, since we've had cheap paper and the printing press, we have developed into a literate culture where we need to have everything in writing. In ancient times, before that was the case, they were an oral culture where it was the spoken word that was important and that they listened to. And so in oral cultures, they have ways of speaking when they need to that make things easier to remember. And this isn't really what it's like, but just for example, from our lives, in our experience, if something is set to verse and then put to music, we are much more likely to remember it than if it's just something that is said. And so just the ways of expressing things can make it a whole lot easier to remember. Thus, the final result, once they get it all together, would be accurate, but not necessarily complete. And especially if we compare the Gospels, we can see different bits in and out in each one. And combining the different stories, we can often get a more complete picture, even if not a full one. Now, as I said, they were an oral culture writing materials were not dirt cheap, and they didn't have a printing press, but they were still a literate people. By and large, they could read and write. We're not talking savages here, we're talking civilizations. Civilizations that had been developing over thousands of years. And part of civilization is reading and writing. So they were an oral culture, but a literate people by and large. Now, according to R.H. Grundy, in his book, The Use of the Old Testament in Matthew's Gospel, the only hypothesis with enough flexibility to meet the requirements is that of a body of loose notes stands behind the bulk of the synoptic tradition. The wide use of shorthand and the carrying of notebooks in the Greco-Roman world, the school practice of circulating lecture notes and utilising them in publicised works, and the later transmission of rabbinic tradition through shorthand notes support this hypothesis. As a former publican, the Apostle Matthew would have been admirably fitted to fill a position as note-taker in the band of uneducated apostles. So then, when were they written? There are three main periods, loosely, proposed for the writing of the Gospels. One in the early to mid 2nd century, roughly between, say, 120 and 150 AD. Or two, between 70 and 90 for the Synoptics, and between 80 and 96 roughly for John. Or three, between AD 40 and 70. Or some combination of the above. Now, option one implies, and in fact requires, that these were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, but by others appropriating, also pseudepigraphing their names. These dates are relatively recent propositions and contradict the testimony of those much nearer in time to the writing. And it also poses the question as to how they came to be received the way they clearly were by the church, especially given how careful they were that no others were similarly accepted. Option two is proposed for two main reasons. Firstly, there is the statement by Papias and others that Mark wrote Peter's words after Peter's departure, where the word departure is interpreted to mean Peter's crucifixion in Rome, which happened around about 67 AD. That would mean then that Mark's Gospel would have to have been written after 67, that'd be 68 at the earliest, and thus combine that with the belief in the theory of Markan priority that Matthew and Luke depend upon Mark, then Matthew and Luke must have been written later again. And of course, John sometime later after that. The second reason is that prophecies by Jesus of the destruction of Jerusalem exist in Matthew, Mark and Luke. And that destruction of Jerusalem happened in AD 70. Jesus could not have known about that, and since prophecy is impossible, you can't know the future, then of course it must have been written after the event. So therefore, Matthew, Mark and Luke must have been written after 70 AD, so that they could know to write that back. But this, of course, is begging the question, and is no proof at all. It negates the significance, it negates to a significant extent both the value of Jesus and of the gospel record, which I suppose is the point. Also, another problem with the first point about Mark being written after Peter's death, that would also imply that Matthew had to have been written after the Apostle Matthew himself had died. So there's that issue there again. Now, the pointers towards an early writing. Luke and Acts are successive volumes by the same author, and Kevin covered this in a little bit of detail recently, so I won't go into it further tonight. And the internal evidence in the book of Acts very strongly suggests that it was written around about 62 AD. And there are very good reasons to accept that, and none that I'm aware of to reject it. Thus, Luke's Gospel must have been written prior to 62 AD. As I mentioned before, Matthew, Mark and Luke prophesy the destruction of Jerusalem, but somehow or other they do not mention the fulfilment. And I cannot think of any plausible scenario whereby if they knew about it and wrote after the event, that they could keep themselves from saying, it happened just like Jesus said. There's no mention of the fulfillment there. And thirdly, in John chapter 5 and verse 2, he writes, in Jerusalem there is a pool called Bethesda. Not was a pool, but is a pool. And this implies that it was written prior to 70 AD. Doesn't prove anything, but that implication is there. The belief of the early church is that Matthew and Mark were written before Luke. For example, in the Marcionite prologue to Luke, which I read earlier, it says, although Gospels had already been written, indeed by Matthew in Judea and by Mark in Italy, moved by the Holy Spirit, he wrote down this Gospel in the parts of Achaia, signifying in the preface that the others were written before his, and thus prior to 60 AD. According to the Muritorian fragment, also quoted earlier, the Apostle Andrew was instrumental in convincing John to write his Gospel, and was also one of the ones putting his imprimatur at the end of John's Gospel. Andrew was crucified in Patras, which is in Greece, on the 30th of November AD 69. And St. Andrew's Day is still celebrated to this day on the 30th of November in commemoration of that. Thus putting the writing of John probably in round about AD 68. It is also interesting to note the view of the early church that the order of writing was Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Hence the order we find it in our Bibles. Referring back to another talk we had earlier this year by Matt Gray, he was speaking about the destruction of the library in Alexandria. And in that, he waxed eloquent about Origen and his great academic standing and wisdom and intelligence, and how highly he was respected in the ancient world at that time. So Origen in the early 200s wrote that, as having learned by tradition concerning the four Gospels, which alone are unquestionable in the Church of God under heaven, that first was written, that according to Matthew, who was once a tax collector but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, who published for those who from Judaism came to believe, composed as it was in the Hebrew language. Secondly, that according to Mark, who wrote it in accordance with Peter's instructions. And thirdly, that according to Luke, who wrote for those who from the Gentiles came to believe, the gospel that was praised by Paul. And after them all, that according to John. And other and earlier writers also expressed the same. So, according to Wenham's analysis, Matthew wrote first in Hebrew or Aramaic. Peter was aware of Matthew's gospel, and Mark wrote Peter's teaching backed up by referring to Matthew. Luke knew both Matthew and Mark and used them along with his own material. He needed to keep his work short enough to be able to fit it all on one scroll. So he abbreviated and left out what he could of what he took from Matthew and Mark because, well, they were available separately anyway, in order to be able to fit in all of his extra material. Thus, Matthew was written somewhere between AD 32 and 42. Luke around about AD 45. Luke AD 54 and John AD 68. So, putting it all together and just getting an overall picture, Matthew was written very early when the church was totally Jewish. He wrote for Jews, and his central purpose was to show that Jesus was the promised Messiah and fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. It was written to appeal to Jews. Mark was written in Rome to appeal to imperial Romans and to everyone else there that were imbued with that ethos. And in it, he makes a big deal of Jesus' power and authority. And he presents Jesus as a man of action, much more so than do the other Gospels. Luke was written later, when the church was still largely Jewish in nature, but with a large and growing non-Jewish element. It was written more for those non-Jews, and especially Greeks and Greek-thinking people. Luke, differently to the others, shows a greater interest in women, in the disadvantaged and downtrodden, and in Gentiles. And finally, John, written later again with the full knowledge of the other three. And it was at a time when Jerusalem was about to be destroyed, and the mother church in Jerusalem was already no more. He wrote to provide a record of the teachings of Jesus at important times, and made a special effort to not repeat things that were already available in the others. And in the very few stories that we do have in John that are in the other Gospels, he leaves out pretty much everything that's provided in the other Gospels about those events and provides other details himself just to widen things out a bit more. Thus, it was designed to complement the other Gospels. And also important to John in his writing were what are translated as signs, significant evidence to make faith in Jesus the only reasonable response. So in conclusion, I'll repeat the statement I made at the beginning, that at this distance, it is impossible to know for sure. Late dates, as in later than 100 AD, are not in accord with the evidence and are generally proposed for other reasons. Late dates that are not quite so late, between later than 60 or 70, between say 70 to 90 AD, are usually proposed for goodish reasons, but are not really in accord with the original testimony. So there are good reasons to believe the traditional authorship, order and dating, and insufficient good reasons not to. And just a little disclaimer at the end there, note my scholarship is not good enough to carry this argument. I'm standing on the shoulders of others. Which finally leads us to bibliography, some of what I drew from. So let's have a break and we'll come back later for question time.